And then the floor is all yours when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Marleen and Faith, for inviting me. And yeah, it's my pleasure to present on bridging the last mile to communities in early warning systems. Yeah, let's start, let's say, a bit high level, but as we all know, I think there are or will be more climate-related disasters, so we will have an increased impact in the coming years. For example, studies from the UNDR and the MDOT database in Leuven have shown, also based on a historical analysis. And a recent study by the IFRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross, has shown what the cost will be of doing nothing. Because climate change is a double threat to vulnerable communities. We will get more extreme weather events, and also the climate change macroeconomic impacts will reduce the resilience amongst the world's poorest and leaving them less able to manage shocks. So investment in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction is essential. And well, we can talk, of course, about early warning systems, but there is also really a paradigm shift going on in terms of early warning, early action, focus-based financing, anticipatory action, and several governments and humanitarian agencies like World Food Programme, FAO, the Red Cross movement. We are now all working on this to have also funds or make that funds available that are normally for disaster response, but also use them for early action. In terms of early warning systems, yeah, whose responsibility is it actually? Well, the mandate is with governments, and also a UNEP report from 2015 explained that early warning is a basic human right because climate change and disasters contribute to human rights violation. And the early warning systems have economic characteristics of public goods, and they're very difficult to be privately funded. There are examples, I think, of early warning systems that are really dedicated to, for example, the agricultural sector, where in that case you can sometimes have systems that are, let's say, against a fee, but then it's also for really a specific segment. However, taxation systems in especially developing countries do not usually ensure enough public funding. So the provisioning of these early warnings to the last mile, to communities on the ground is often hampered. And since the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, greater attention has been given to early warning systems, and it's also now addressed in key global agreements and their predecessors like the Hyogo Framework for Action or the Millennium Development Goals, but now also in Paris, Sendai and the Sustainable Development Goals. Part of what I'm telling here actually is also written down in a book that Brian Golding is editing, so it may be good to make a small advertisement for that. It's a book that will be called Towards the Perfect Warning. Then in terms of how can we measure if the last mile is reached? Well, the Hyogo Framework for Action had as one of its priorities for action this, let's say, area around identify, assess and monitor disaster risk and enhance early warning. And one of the core indicators under this priority for action was, I have to shift now the camera a bit, whether early warning systems are in place for all major hazards with outreach to communities. And do they receive timely and understandable warnings? And then in the Sendai framework that's now ongoing, we have the global target G, that also is around a similar aspect, let's say, to look into whether the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to people has increased. And one of the indicators is the number of people per 100,000 that are covered by early warning. So now you all might wonder, of course, what kind of reporting has been going on these indicators. I've been looking in the past a bit on the reporting for the Hyogo Framework for Action, but now also the results are coming in from the Sendai monitor. And I plotted here just, yeah, let's say for 3 countries, to give an example, the results of the recent reporting. So, for example, you can see the green line, it's Nepal, 2015 to 2019. It seems to have increased up to like almost 40–50%. For Malawi, maybe even close to 80%. And the top line, the orange one, is Germany. They are at like a 100% score. Yeah, everyone is reached or covered by early warning information. However, I would say there are, let's say, yeah, a bit caveats, because this reporting is multi-hazard, it's country-wide, whereas this is, yeah, also, I have to say, quite difficult to measure. It's self-reporting because Sendai is a non-binding agreement. So there is, let's say, not a really strict review mechanism in place, and there is only limited standardization of how to measure this. And to my current understanding, it's not based on, let's say, representative surveys conducted by the governments among communities. And in some cases, we have seen from, for example, the global network for DRR, that local self-reporting seems to give a more realistic picture and actually less optimistic numbers than this national self-reporting. So I would like to contrast this, let's say, national reporting with, let's say, using an in-depth evaluation methodology. This is an example of a pilot warning system. So it was actually not a real, let's say, official warning system that was in place, but a pilot warning system where flood forecasts were disseminated to communities via voice messages, but also indirectly via volunteers on the ground from, for example, the Red Cross. And then also people could get access to information via, for example, radio and TV. And what this pilot showed was that 87% of the people received it, and then a slightly smaller group really understood it. Then people had to trust the message, and finally people also acted upon it. And you can see, of course, there is a, let's say, or of course, but there is a bit of difference between how many people acted on it and how many people received the message. And in this example, you can see that hand loomer, he was able to save nearly $1,000 by rearranging his machinery to avoid damage because of the floods. So as you can see, to actually answer the question, is the last mile reached? We need really a kind of an evaluation around what are the characteristics of the community, around the delivery channel, the communication channel, and around the warning information. So it's not that easy to answer this question, let alone for multiple hazards. Then just in terms of early warning systems, I think, yeah, probably a lot of us know this already, but just maybe to clarify what I'm going to talk about, is that we might have early warning systems. Well, it's not really a system then maybe, but let's say the local knowledge of people. In the Red Cross, we talk about community early warning systems that can be community-based or community-driven. And on the right, you see this table that kind of tries to explain the difference. Community-based is with the people, but it's often then with an outside partner like an NGO who is kind of starting it up. But it can also be a community-driven early warning system when it's really by the people, and it's really, let's say, restructuring also the social fabric. And at the bottom, you can see work from one of the students of the Free University of Amsterdam. She has looked into also the lead times of these different systems. And you can see in blue that the national forecasting systems, or the official forecasts, they have usually seasonal, let's say weekly and daily forecasts. The local knowledge can also be over the whole season. But then the community-based system is usually only, let's say, a day or a few hours. And it's often based on, in case of a flood system, on people living upstream and downstream, and they read regularly the river gauges and they communicate with one another. And then ideally would like to go from these different early warning systems to one combined, people-centered, integrated, end-to-end and multi-hazard early warning system. And also, yeah, the WMO has this checklist for this. And this is, of course, let's say the holy grail where we want to end up. But, well, again, this example from Malawi, there we see actually that we have still more silos of, let's say, the local knowledge, the community-based early warning system, and then the national early warning system. And in some cases, there are links being established between the community early warning system and the national early warning system. As you can see here with some of these lines, there are sometimes some links being established. And then for which hazard? Well, recently a study has been done by the IFRC, and I think also Arielle Rosier de la Poterie is in the call, so she can explain more about the study later on maybe. But the study was about mapping Red Cross present national societies and what they are doing in terms of early warning systems. So 93 Red Cross national societies reported working on early warning systems in different ways. And 29 of them are currently working on early warning, early action, so forecast-based financing systems. Especially the forecast-based financing is really a silo approach until now. We are working on separate, let's say, early action protocols for one hazard at a time. Then what we can see in this left table is that there are, of course, different hazards where you can find information about in literature. Most literature is around flooding. And if you then look at the Red Cross, within the Red Cross, 65% of the national societies are working on flood early warning systems. And then drought comes in second. That's just to give you a bit of a feel. Let's say truly multi-hazard systems, I think there are not that many yet. Then, well, the four risk components, I want now to dive into them a little bit more in detail. Well, there are four, of course, I think these are well known, but I would like to, let's say, also discuss shortly, let's say, actors and governance, a bit the overarching theme. Well, in the end, all these four components have to work well. It's also the valleys of death that we have to bridge. But are we working on all these four components, let's say, yeah, as much? Are we spending as much time on all these components or not? Well, in literature, and this is again this study from IFRC on advancing an end-to-end approach to early warning systems. From this study, you can see that most literature is around monitoring and communication. And within the Red Cross, most national societies reported to be working on risk knowledge. So, for example, vulnerability and capacity assessments, or preparedness for effective response type of analysis. And then second was response capability. For example, giving trainings and awareness raising in communities. And the third one was communication. I will now, and looking at the time, but I think still a bit of time, I will focus on two of these components, because I think they are most relevant for this community of RiskKAN. So, but before that, maybe to briefly introduce the complexity in terms of actors. Here you can see a map of the actors in, for example, the drought early warning system in Malawi. Many actors, and they are then also still at the global, up to the local level. And in terms of this community early warning system, there are several NGOs working on this. So there are also many actors for the community system. So now I'll dive into these two components, monitoring, warning, and communication. In terms of monitoring, warning, well, what you usually see, and I take again the example of flood early warning, or let's say more hydrological hazards. River gauges are usually along the main river, or let's say rain gauges are at some key places in the country, but the density often does not mean the WMO guidelines for hydrological station density. And well, on the right, you can see a map. I could not find one for river gauges, but this one is for rain gauges. Yeah, you can see that the distance from the nearest gauge is often more than 100 kilometers in let's say, developing countries. Community-based early warning systems can kind of jump in, but they definitely do not cover all flood-prone communities, and they provide only these short lead times. They're often in tributaries or secondary river basins, but usually they're not integrated robustly into the national early warning systems. So how could we go to a higher density of observation networks? Well, evidence for Bangladesh showed, for example, that the operational cost of gauges is a significant percentage of the overall early warning system costs. So, well, the idea could be to reduce these costs by having targeted crowdsourcing. That might be cost effective, but it brings along uncertainties in relation to the continuity and validity of the collection. And we see this challenge as well if a community early warning system is project-based, then if the project ends, of course, then also the data collection might end. If we look at the modeling part, a lot of the national early warning systems, given limited budget and capacity, have to rely on existing kind of copycat type of technology or on regional global forecasting systems. So, for example, for Malawi, there is now only a local hydrological model available for the southern part of Malawi. And for the rest, we are trying to see if we can use GLOFAS. And a recent WMO white paper on the future of weather and climate forecasting, and this might be too much detail to read out, but it made some clear statements around, for example, the inequality in data availability in developing countries and the responsibility of organizations to share data. And also in terms of funding, that often funding might go to, let's say, equipment, whereas the self-identified goals and needs of the national meteorological and hydrological services might actually be different. And in terms of collaboration, and that might be maybe also one we could discuss with the RiskKAN working group, is that let's say the numerical or weather services and models also require investment in academic institutions in developing countries to be able to carry out this targeted research. And collaboration between universities of developed and developing countries would be really advantageous. Then the component communication and dissemination. Well, as I explained before, it is the mandate of the national meteorological and hydrological services. And you can see here on the right a diagram we made for a drought information in Malawi, and how you see here from August till November, how it goes from warning generation to communication and dissemination to the field, and which organizations are involved. And you can see it's often quite complex and many organizations involved. So I guess we can call this first part, the official part, more the dissemination part. And then the communication to the communities is often done via such a community early warning system. But to reach these communities and to reach scale, well, digital, let's say the data revolution could be useful, of course. Mobile phone penetration has increased tremendously. On the right, you can see a picture when I was in Bangladesh a while ago, and many people had already, of course, phones. But yeah, there is still a large digital divide in terms of internet access, for example, or data literacy. You can see here that this map, access to internet is still very weak in some developing countries. And this, of course, hinders access to forecast information. We are now working and let's say a bit experimenting with establishing WhatsApp groups in, for example, Malawi, but also in Uganda, between upstream and downstream communities. And in these WhatsApp groups, there is a mix of people on the ground from disaster committees, management committees, but also forecasters from the national level who share, let's say, official forecast information. And then you can see also local people sharing observations about, for example, birds that indicate rain coming. So there is a lot of information flying around. And yeah, we are trying to understand better how this local and scientific knowledge is triangulated. So yeah, reaching a kind of a summary in terms of the challenges in reaching the last mile. Well, first of all, access to the services. I think we could say that in most developing countries, the national early warning systems do not effectively reach the poor and vulnerable communities. It's also sometimes not their mandate. Community early warning systems try to bridge this gap, but they definitely do not cover all hazard-prone communities, have only short lead times in case of floods, for example, and are not well integrated. Then in terms of access to technology and knowledge, the national meteorological and hydrological services are very limited in their possibility to improve the resolution of their forecast. They lack funding and capacity. And the poor and the vulnerable, they can often not benefit from all this information due to this digital divide. And then this I have not discussed that much, but there is also still, let's say, a governance issue. For example, transboundary early warning systems in Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. There are also issues, of course, in sharing information across boundaries between organizations. And there is a plethora of reporting frameworks that makes it also difficult to track progress. And well, is a transformation possible? On the left, you see these different systems, local knowledge, community-based, national. Can we go to this one integrated system with also more use of technology? Well, I think these global agreements, Sendai, and also technology capacity and funding can help, of course, in getting there. So yeah, to conclude, in terms of leaving no one behind, I think vulnerable communities are and will be disproportionately affected by climate change. And right now they can benefit only to a limited extent from what is technically possible. So to reach similar forecast scale, in terms of this component of monitoring and warning, and in terms of bridging the digital divide, the component of communication and dissemination, this will require means of implementation, technology transfer, capacity development, and funding, of course. And this should be supported by, I think, more subnational and disaggregated reporting on the progress to deliver to the last mile. And well, there's also research ongoing around, let's say, how social justice principles, such as distributive and normative justice, could drive the allocation of these means of implementation. And yeah, with that, I would like to hand over to Marleen.
Great, thanks, Marc. That was very interesting. Thank you for shining a light on the vulnerable communities. Thanks a lot. And so again, for everyone who has questions for Marc, you can put them in the chat. And then we'll now go to the second talk, and then we come back to all the questions after the next talk. But thanks again, Marc. That was very interesting. So for the next talk, we have two speakers. Amy Polen is finishing up her master's degree at the University of South Florida College of Public Health on disaster management. She's a graduate assistant in the Florida Center for Community Design and Research on Vulnerability, Mitigation, and Policy Studies. She will be co-presenting today with Nadia Bloemendaal. Nadia is a postdoc at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the VU Amsterdam and at Allianz. Her research focuses on the risk of tropical cyclones under climate change. And Amy and Nadia will talk to you about hurricane evacuation decisions and the new tropical cyclone severity scale that they developed. Amy, I think it's you first.
Thank you for the introductions. So yeah.
You can see the screen, right?
Yes, we can see the screen. And also just let me know if I cut out at all. My internet is clearly lagging today. So, but yes, today we're going to be talking about hurricane evacuation decisions and the newly created tropical cyclone severity scale. Go ahead. So to begin to talk about hurricane evacuations, I think it's important to have some context to why people decide to evacuate or not. And so I just wanted to run through very quickly just a couple of points of interest in the literature on evacuation decision making, starting with financial reasons for evacuation. So if you have the money or don't have the money to pay for gas to evacuate, or to pay for a hotel when you're doing an evacuation decision, to have enough supplies, a 2-week supply at home of food and water, issues of that nature. Also, your social networks, how they influence your evacuation decision. What are your neighbors doing? What are your coworkers doing? Your friends, are they evacuating or are they leaving? That has been shown to have a pretty significant effect on influencing your evacuation decision. Information availability and your sources of information. How does that affect your evacuation decision? And that is a whole topic in and of itself, so I won't get too deep into it, but the effect of media on evacuation decision making? Do you have access to internet to be able to get quick updated information while you're on the go during an evacuation event? Your family. So this can include family members that are unable to evacuate or unwilling to evacuate. This can also include pets, which have been shown to be a large influence in evacuation decision. Prior experience in hurricanes, this is kind of a dual-edged sword. People either have very poor experiences with with a hurricane that they stayed for. They may be more likely to evacuate in the future. Individuals who fled with the boy who cried wolf syndrome, who ended up leaving for a hurricane that ended up not causing a lot of damage. They may be less hesitant or more hesitant in the future to evacuate. Disability, so if you have a medical disability that requires you to have a steady supply of oxygen or connection to electricity for medical refrigeration, things like that. Or if you have a physical disability that prevents you from actually moving around on normal transportation easily. Your job, so if you're an essential worker or a healthcare worker who has to stay. And then finally, risk perception, which I'm going to go into a little bit on the next slide. So your risk perception is, and I think this is very critical to kind of define at the beginning of this talk, it can be talked about as the personal feelings of risk. It's your beliefs about the potential harm or the possibility of a loss. This is a very subjective and personal judgment call that you make based on your demographics, your upbringing, environmental cues, and social cues. And typically, individuals have a risk perception gap, which is where their perception of risk is inherently skewed based on the information that they're receiving and their own personal bias, where they either under or overrepresent risk. And risk perception is very, very critical for us as researchers, because this is one of the formative places that you can make a difference in, encouraging evacuation decisions by having people properly assess their risk. So to kind of go off of that same idea of risk perception, I'm going to present the productive action decision-making model. It was designed by Lindell and Perry in 2012, and this is a tool that emergency managers use to kind of visualize what's going on inside of people's heads when they're trying to make an evacuation decision. So in that left column there, you can see different factors that influence evacuation decisions. In the center box, you can see the act of actually processing that information and then making a protective action decision. And then finally, on the very right, you can see how it would encourage a behavioral response, which could be staying at home, evacuating, going to a shelter, anything like that. Specifically in this talk, I would like you guys to focus on the information sources and warning messages, since that's relevant to EWS, and how that could affect the later stages in the PAVM. And specifically, another topic that's important within this model is the topic of milling. And milling is like casually known as confirm first and then act later. So the process of milling occurs when people get inadequate or maybe conflicting information sources that leads them to spend time confirming this information to make their evacuation decision, thus wasting valuable time where they could be evacuating or preparing their house while they're kind of in this in-between zone. A good example of milling was actually during the 9/11 attacks, where individuals, instead of leaving the building, were trying to find information from like reliable sources, and instead had a very big effect on the outcome of that emergency scenario. So why does this matter in the context of hurricane scales? I've been talking a lot about like the sociology of evacuation, but this is very relevant, especially the risk perception gap and the PADM, because a lot of individuals heavily rely on a hurricane scale to make their evacuation decisions. And right now, the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale only accounts for wind hazards and not water hazards. So then I'm going to give you a quick example from my current research to kind of exemplify the influence of categories on hurricane evacuation. Hurricane Sally made landfall in September of 2020. It was described as an erratic hurricane. It made landfall in Alabama, but affected as far out as Louisiana and Florida as well. It was a complex water-driven storm system that had heavy rainfall flooding particularly. And there were a lot of feelings of mistrust and misinformation due to a rapid intensification right before landfall, where it went from a category 1 to a category 2. And a lot of people felt that this lack of information led to milling and Additionally, it was just a confusing time because it was a minor hurricane that actually caused fairly significant damage, especially in the Florida Panhandle. So in a current survey that I've been working on, we surveyed individuals who experienced Hurricane Sally, actually for a COVID-19 and hurricane evacuation survey. But at the very end, we asked some qualitative feedback from these individuals. So I pulled a couple of relevant quotes to kind of give an example from a personal perspective of what we've been talking about so far. So this area did not have adequate forecasting, and I was truly caught off guard without proper warnings. The predictions were wildly different, therefore it was hard to prepare effectively. I did not evacuate since Sally was predicted to be a Cat 1. Had I known how strong and slow she would be, I would have evacuated. I think everyone was surprised by the intensity. If it would have been a 3 or higher, we would have left. And then finally, my personal favorite, you don't evacuate for a 2 unless you live directly on the water. You think about it for a 3 and you get out for a 4 or 5. So currently the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, in addition to like Weather Channel and other sources of information, have been attempting to provide a more broad viewpoint of what a hurricane could entail beyond just the category system in the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. But clearly it's a lot of information to process. They've been slowly introducing it, but as of 2020, they started including the storm surge graphics. But if you see all this information, even as a professional, it's very hard to absorb and process and then make an adequate and properly assessed evacuation decision. And this can lead to additional milling during the time where people are just trying to gather all of this separate information and form it into one assessment of yes or no, should I stay or should I leave?
So to overcome this whole process of milling and help support risk communication strategies by providing more information, and in addition, keeping that link between evacuation preparedness and the category of the Saffir-Simpson scale into the back of our minds, Amy, myself, and a bunch of other co-authors decided it was time that we were going to design a new scale for hurricane categorization. And on this scale, we want to make sure that we have one category that reflects all major hazards. So keep in mind the currently used Saffir-Simpson scale only reflects on wind. But as you saw from Hurricane Sally, it's also really important to reflect on storm surge and rainfall. Secondly, we want the scale to be used on a pre-landfall basis, and that way we can support the risk communication by the meteorologists and local governments and such. We want the scale to be discrete, as a discrete scale is easiest understood by the public, as various research has shown in the past. And preferably, we want to have the scale to have the same categories as the currently used Saffir-Simpson scale, because including like a whole new set of categories or color schemes or whatever is only going to confuse the public because they've been used to these categories for decades now already. Lastly, we want to extend the scale with a category 6. And this might sound a bit weird, but there has already been a lot of ongoing discussion amongst researchers whether the currently used Saffir-Simpson scale should be extended with a category 6 to reflect on the most intense tropical cyclones that are out there. So just for your understanding, Hurricane Irma or Hurricane Dorian would have, for instance, been classified as a category 6 had that category existed. We want to include a category 6 so that we can communicate about the most extreme storms. So these are storms that have both extremely intense wind speeds and high storm surge or rainfall, where category 5 feels like it doesn't cover the extent of the severity enough. So we're not the first ones to come up with a new scale to replace the Saffir-Simpson scale. In fact, there have been a whole bunch of other studies that have tried to overcome the limitations of the Saffir-Simpson scale in the past. And this table gives an overview of some of these scales, but it also shows that none of these scales actually ticks all the boxes that we just set ourselves. The only scale that comes really close is the hurricane classification system, but that scale was deliberately designed to be used on a post-landfall basis. So it's not really used for risk communication or suitable for risk communication at this point. Now, to demonstrate how our scale works, we want to show you the example of like the infamous Hurricane Florence. And Hurricane Florence is a really good example of where the Saffir-Simpson scale and the risk communication went wrong. Because Hurricane Florence was a Category 4, so actually a major hurricane, when it was still out over the open water. But risk communicators had already told people that it was going to weaken to a Category 1 to 2 prior to landfall. So actually what happened was that a lot of people stayed in their places because they thought, well, it's weakening from a Category 4 to like a Category 1. So, you know, the worst is over. How bad can it be? I'm going to stay in my place. Actually, Hurricane Florence, just like Hurricane Sally and many other hurricanes, was a major storm surge and precipitation event. So the fact that the wind speed had dropped didn't really matter for the severity that it was going to cause once it was going to move on shore. And many people were actually really caught off guard by the fact that Hurricane Florence was going to dump a lot of rain and they couldn't evacuate anymore at that point. So I already mentioned Hurricane Florence at the landfall was a borderline Category 1, Category 2 tropical cyclone. And the way that we designed this scale is that it's basically an extension of the Saffir-Simpson scale. So the wind speeds that you see here are similar to the ones that we use for the Saffir-Simpson scale, but we added 2 more categories for storm surge and rainfall. Now, the thresholds that we set for each of the categories, they are derived based on what we found in historical tropical cyclone reports. So for instance, the 750 millimeter rainfall event, that's commonly classified as catastrophic by the tropical cyclone reports that are out there on the NOAA website. So, okay, back to Hurricane Florence. Hurricane Florence was a Category 1 on wind speed, but on our scale, Florence would have classified as a Category 4 for storm surge because at the landfall location, they registered a 3.35 meter high storm surge. And for rainfall, Florence actually classifies as a Category 5 with rainfall totals exceeding 900 millimeters just at the landfall location. Now, the thing is, we now have 3 categories. So we have the Category 1 for rainfall, the Category 4 for storm surge, and the Category 5. We have the Category 1 for wind speed. You see, like, I'm already getting really confused. It's really confusing when we have 3 separate categories going on for 3 separate hazards. That's not going to work, especially not if you're trying to communicate it. I even already have problems communicating this, as you can notice. So we need to combine this into one final category. And that way we can communicate that one category to the public. And then it's immediately clear, okay, this is a very severe hazardous storm. We need to get out of the way. How are we going to do that? So the way that we did this is we assigned rescaling values to each of the separate categories. So as you can see, for Category 1, we add a rescaling value of 0.5. A Category 4 gets a rescaling value of 20. And a Category 5 gets a rescaling value of 40. Then if we add this all up, we end up with a sum of 60.5. Then we move over to the final table. And in this final table, we convert that rescaling value back to a final category. And here you can see that Florence would have actually classified as a Category 5 on the tropical cyclone severity scale. So just keep in the back of your mind, also from Amy's survey, that a lot of people would have undertaken action had it been a Category 3, 4, 5. Probably people would have acted a lot, I don't want to say responsible, but you know, people would have acted differently had they heard that it was a Category 5 coming their way instead of a Category 1. Now, one problem with the Saffir-Simpson scale is robustness. And that's, for instance, with Florence weakening from a Category 4 to a Category 1, but also Sally intensifying from Category 1 to a Category 2 just prior before landfall. In order to demonstrate the robustness of the TCSS, we're just going to assume that Florence had stayed a Category 4 just prior to landfall. So instead of having this Category 1 for wind, we're going to add the wind Category 4, which means that we have a total sum of 80 instead of 60.5. This means that also on our final category scale, we would have still ended up with a Category 5. So despite that weakening in wind speed, or had it been intensifying or whatever, it would have still been a category 5, because this category 5 is mainly driven by the fact that it was such a high rainfall event. So the fact that that wind speed was slightly different or anything doesn't really matter for the final category. So how can we apply this TCSS? Now, the TCSS is particularly useful to apply on a local scale, because of course, not every hazard might be experienced by every person under the imminent threat of the tropical cyclone. I mean, if you live near the coast, you might experience a storm surge, whereas if you live further inland, you might be hit by more rainfall and you probably won't see a storm surge coming your way. So in order to account for that, here is an example of Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey was an extreme precipitation event in 2017. It actually dumped over 1.5 meters of rainfall near the Houston area. And as you can see here, this is also reflected by our TCSS, which is shown on the right, as opposed to the Saffir-Simpson scale, which if you would apply that to every affected area, would have just classified as a tropical storm for most of the region. But on our TCSS, you'd see category 5s in the heavy precipitation areas, category 4, category 3. So there is much more a spread in terms of the severity of the tropical cyclone in the landfall location. Now, lastly, I want to come back to Hurricane Sally. Amy has already discussed this in her section. A lot of people did not really respond because Hurricane Sally was only a category 1, category 2 event. Had people known that it would have been so severe, they would have probably acted differently. So in order to show you what would happen if we rank Hurricane Sally, I dug up the just released hurricane report for Sally. And what we found there was that at landfall, Hurricane Sally had a wind speed of 49 meters per second, which is category 2 on our scale, and also on the Saffir-Simpson scale, by the way. For storm surge, it was just below 1 meter, so that's a category 1. And for rainfall, Sally would have classified as a category 5. Now, if we again add up all these rescaling values, we see that Hurricane Sally would have been a category 5. So imagine communicating a category 5 instead of a category 2. People would have likely responded differently. I'm gonna come back to that in 1 second, by the way. And this quote from Amy's survey would have, puts it in a whole different perspective than knowing that on our scale, it would have been a category 5. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to test whether the general public would actually respond differently if tropical cyclones were communicated based on our TCSS as opposed to the Saffir-Simpson scale. So would people have actually evacuated had Sally been a category 5 instead of a category 1, category 2 event? We hope to eventually present this to the National Hurricane Center because they are like the primary responsible party here for hurricane risk communication when there is an imminent storm coming. We also put this up on our slide because if you are interested in collaborating on this, please reach out to Amy and I, because we're always looking for collaboration. We're looking for ideas on how to set up this survey. So if you have any good ideas, suggestions, whatever, please reach out. We're very open to collaborate on this. Now, if you want to read more about the skill, this is the paper that we published about this last January. I actually noticed that Priscilla is here in the audience as well. I just want to give a huge shout out to her because this paper is based on her bachelor thesis. She did like the preliminary work for this whole skill. So if you're going to do an applause, also do an applause for Priscilla, please. And then lastly, on behalf of Amy and of course myself, I want to say thank you for listening to us. And I think it's now time for questions, Marlene. I think
it is indeed. Thank you, Nadia. Thanks, Amy, for a very interesting talk. I think lots of questions were already popped in the chat, but maybe people want to just speak up. Feel free to turn on your camera and then ask your questions live, because that's just nicer than me reading out questions. Who can I? Bart, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nadia and Amy. It's interesting. And by the way, also thanks to Mark for the other talk. But then maybe in between, it's about communication. But I actually, for sure, for the US, I would be surprised if the only way to convey the message of an early warning for a hurricane is a category number. And we are used to so many, guidances by meteorologists like a week in advance of the hurricane landfall, etc. So I understand that, simplicity is part of the communication, but simplicity in just having only one number as the signal value is a bit naive, it seems. And a category 4 situation can be expected to give a surge downstream, even if the wind has disappeared. And I guess it's been part of the communication of this event, but it's yeah, that's my question, whether it's really coming down to this simple categorical communication.
I think that Amy can best answer this.
Yeah.
This is also about perception.
Yes.
Yeah, so I agree with you entirely that it is better. A lot of risk communications research has shown that it's really hard to strike the balance between too much and too little information. If there's too much, it's hard to process. If there's too little, that can lead to the milling effect that I talked about. Mm-hmm. But just from anecdotally, I've been researching hurricane evacuation behavior since 2016. And a lot of times last minute decision making is based on that category system. I know that a lot of people say that it was like very high in our last survey, like 75% of people said that the category of the storm affected their decision making for a hurricane. And as such, it's good to reflect all the hazards within one number, but it's also good to supplement it with additional information. So it's a hard balance to strike. That's why we want to do that survey to figure out.
That's I guess what I'd like to make explicit.
Yeah. So that's why I think one of the suggestions were this skill going to be used by the National Hurricane Center at one point. I think one of the suggestions that we want to make is that it's fine to communicate the final category. I mean, that's why we designed it. But of course, you can also just communicate the separate categories. So if you say like for instance, in the case of Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Florence is a category 5, and this is mainly a category 5 because of the extreme rainfall coming your way, so that people know where the hazard is coming from. But communicating Florence as a 145, that's gonna be so confusing for people. Like I even had a hard time pronouncing that. So that's why we designed the skill that we did. Yeah. And
I would also like to, I was just gonna say, I'd also like to say just one more thing is that people underestimate how much individuals can process. It just needs to be given in a good format. I've heard a lot of times comments from meteorologists, like just casually like, oh, it's so hard to give all this information. Like, do people even listen to it? Do they even understand it when I show these graphics? I think you should give people credit that they could easily transition over to another scale. And that if we taught individuals how to actually properly use all the information coming at them, that they would be able to use that to make an evacuation decision. So
I see 2 raised hands. We'll first go to Brian and then to Pia Johanna.
Thank you. Yeah, great talk. Great talks, both of them. On the scale and this business of having a single score representative of different variables, the complexity issue is very real. In the UK, we started naming winter storms about 3 or 4 years ago now, and there was a quantitatively significant increase in the response simply from the fact that giving it a name meant that people took it more seriously. And the same, I believe, has been shown to be true in the US with naming of hurricanes. So even without the category, you've got, the category is an additional complication. We're already going beyond that basic thing. But the question I wanted to ask was, if you have different categories for different variables affecting different areas, what's the headline that you put across? Do you take the maximum So would Harvey have been a category 5 because after it had gone inland, it was going to dump all this water? And would that have confused people on the coast?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. The thing is, indeed, I'm now also like quickly scrolling through the comments in the chat, and I think that you actually post this comment as well, is that of course storm surge and rainfall, sometimes they affect the same area, but more often they don't. So that's why we deliberately want to advertise this skill as you should apply this on a local scale. But the same holds for the Saffir-Simpson scale, because the maximum wind speeds on which the category in the Saffir-Simpson scale is based usually affects only a small area around the eye of the tropical cyclone, which is the eye wall. So regions that are outside of that band, they experience less strong winds. So, I mean, for instance, if there's a category 5 heading towards Amy in Orlando, she probably wouldn't experience the category 5 winds, but likely the category 2 with core 1 even. So I think that this is a really big challenge. Like, what do you convey as like that one single number that you want to send out to the public? And I think, I don't know, like my ideal situation would be, if you remember that last slide from Amy with the enormous amount of figures that's out there, just put one figure out there with like the local scale difference in the scale and in the category value, so that people can see for themselves, like, oh, I live in Houston, so my category is a 5. And then, yeah, I'm afraid that you're still going to have to, if you want to like have like one headline in the media, say that it's a category 5, but then for the Houston area, yeah, that's, I kind of also hope that the surveys will give us more guidance as to what's preferred by the layman public. Amy, are you going to write that down? Survey question.
I can write that down for a survey question, but also by using local forecasting like that Hurricane Harvey graphic, it would minimize a big issue for emergency managers is an effect called shadow evacuations, where individuals will evacuate when there's really no need for them to. And so by forecasting on such a small local scale, individuals don't have to go to shelters. For instance, during Hurricane Irma in Florida, there were more individuals in shelters than there were in hurricane evacuation zones. So people who actually had to evacuate out of like category A, B, and C's, they couldn't actually go to a shelter because so many people in flood zone X and such were going to shelters when they didn't actually need to.
Great. Pia Johanna, you also raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Great talks, great panelists, and also great questions. So I'd like to sort of pick up on that last issue, and also what Nadia has been referring to, sort of what's basically the aim of these numbers. And I'd like to come to sort of the behavioral response we'd like to associate with what people need to take. What's the take-home message for people when we give them a specific number, right? What we want them to do. That's the most important thing, right? It's not just about like science communication, but rather we want to influence people's behavior in quite specific ways. So the thing is that depending on as these natural events, they are dynamic, right? They evolve and they can change their sort of their hazard potentials also. So a bit versatility is also key here, that it's quite clear, although it's 5 or it's a 3 or progressing towards 4, then what's the behavior we want to see happening? So that these are not, because my point is that we can't automatically assume that category 3 requires this behavior, category 4 requires this behavior, and so on and so forth. So it depends on the sort of the dynamic of that hazard. So these two things seem to be separate, but they need to be somehow connected when we really want to generate impact, I think, as we see that. Yeah. Thanks.
No,
Yeah.
I agree with
Maybe a
everything.
short response. Okay.
Yeah. No, I said I agree with everything you said there. Yeah, it's a big struggle because, you know, emergency managers don't know exactly what they should be saying because it's very much on an individual level. Like, let's say you live in a house that was built before the, you know, housing code updates in Florida, you may want to evacuate or not. That's why I think enabling individuals to make the decision appropriately is probably the best route, because it could never be done on a government level. There's just so much that could affect it, in my opinion. So kind of going back to like, you should trust people to give information, but we should also communicate information in the best way possible for them to understand it.
Great, thanks. I know we're over time, but there were quite a few questions for you as well, Marc. So I want to turn to one of those questions in the chat, which read, wonder if you have any reflections on whether the majority of those efforts are focusing on reaching the majority of people or general population, and whether we are missing the opportunities to simultaneously improve communications to truly reach that last mile or last meter. So those who are most marginalized and vulnerable within the communities. And if you have any examples of advice in reaching those most marginalized, including LGBTQ, etc., people with disabilities, elderly, ethnic minorities, etc. That's a lot of questions in one question.
Yeah. Well, thanks, yeah, Marlene and Mariana, I think, who posed this question. And I guess not that easy to answer. Well, as the Red Cross, what we're working on for sure is to try to, let's say, identify and subsequently see if we can target the most vulnerable people. This is actually can also be very dynamic, because it can be, for example, migrant workers or even tourists that are accidentally in an area. So yeah, you might not always be able to do this identification beforehand. But that's let's say one part of the work that's being done, usually maybe I guess as part of the risk knowledge phase, that we try to identify within the community the vulnerable people. And then in some cases it's also possible to delegate responsibilities. So for example, community, disaster management communities, they have, for example, assigned responsibilities where one person will make sure that he goes to people who are physically handicapped, or he will go to elderly people and inform them if it's already clear that they will not receive the warnings the normal way. So that's one way to do it. It's kind of a delegated responsibility. The other, let's say, avenue is to build in redundancy. So not rely on just one channel. It's always multi-channel, and I guess also you are aware of that in Nepal. Use community radio, use text messages, all messages that are possible. A fully digital solution is not usually possible to reach the vulnerable people, so that's why we also have to have this kind of human element to the solution. I think, at least for now. Those are some reflections. I also saw your question about, like, let's say, which organization is responsible for this. Well, in Bangladesh, actually, in this pilot that we did already a while ago, it was the Flood Forecasting and Warning Center who really was, let's say, engaging with us to change the messages content, the warning content in the message, and then to see which one was the most effective. But at the same time, I agree that, let's say, people who are really working on the hydrological modeling are also cannot be communication specialists at the same time. So it has to be, in the end, I think, a really transdisciplinary approach of communication specialists working together with the hydrology people, because it's also about then finding the right information from your hydrological model that is useful and put that in the right way into your warning content. And the message that goes out to the people. So yeah, for a normal early warning system, I'm not that much myself involved in this. For impact-based forecasting or for focus-based financing, we are working on this now. But then it's more about communicating to local, let's say, professionals. So it's not to the last mile. But now we are working on how to best communicate, for example, the humanitarian impact that we can predict of a typhoon arriving in the Philippines, and which kind of information, also which kind of probabilistic information is useful and should be communicated. So there we're working usually now with, or we try to make these matrices that give the probability versus the impact. And that, we do that every 6 hours. And there we're trying to see if that's the right way to communicate this kind of information, but that's in a different, let's say, communication problem or issue. But we're working a bit more on that right now. And in that case, I see also with impact-based forecasting, that's often the National Meteorological and Hydrological Service that is working together with specific sectors. So for example, the Ministry of Agriculture or the ministry that's responsible for traffic. And then they together work on the right content. These are some considerations.
Great, thanks, Marc. And thanks, Mariana, for the very great question. Also, I think there's still some discussion going on in the chat. I also think we'll need to wrap up. I'm not sure if there's one more question that really needs to be asked.
I just want to say to Scott, because I don't have time to type this right now, historical hurricanes are discussed in our paper.
Great, thanks for the PS. So just one more reminder that we have our next seminar coming up on the 24th of June. That time we have a speaker from the University of Melbourne. So for that reason, we'll be at 9 a.m. UK time, 10 a.m. European time. So apologies to everyone in the US. So we'll have Marc Wigley and we'll have Dr. Evan Easton Calabria from the University of Oxford and Khairul Shaikh from the German Red Cross delegate in Bangladesh. And we'll be talking about systemic risk and COVID-19 early warnings. And that just leaves me to say thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Brian and Faith. And thank you to all of you attending and for the great questions. And I think that was a great kickoff. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Marley.
And we can put the, thanks. The information here.
Thanks, Marlene.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
So awkward to leave now.
I know.
I know.
Because as a speaker, you feel you can't leave until the very end.
No, I'm just
Great
gonna stay.
presentation, so
So.
thanks. Thanks all.
Hi, Simona.
All right, everyone. I actually need to head out, but
Yes.
You can
Faith,
go,
high five.
you can make me host, and then we'll have like a tiny chat here.
Do you think we have time to chat on a what's today? Thursday? That's the very end of the week when everyone's trying to get all their stuff together. At least me.
I know
was
you're
doing
going to
that.
the beach after.
Oh yeah, true.
this.
Wait, yeah, I'm in the morning. I don't know. You guys, you can chat all you want. You're in the afternoon now. So.
all right. I'll see you later, everyone. Take
See
care.
ya.
Bye.